All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today we're taking a look at this article on Mary.
Oh, yeah, this one looks pretty interesting.
It is, it is. It really makes you think about, the different ways that Christianity views Mary,
hmm
especially when you compare, like, Orthodox tradition versus Catholic dogma.
Yeah, that's a good point. There are some pretty distinct differences there.
Right. And this article, like, it gets right into some pretty complex theology,
Well, I think that's what makes it so fascinating.
for sure. You ready to kind of unpack some of these ideas?
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
Okay, so right off the bat, the author kind of throws down this question. How do we honor Mary without, like, crossing the line into worship?
And I think that's a really important question, especially when you look at like the Catholic tradition. You see these grand cathedrals dedicated to Mary, all the statues and paintings. It definitely makes you wonder where that line is.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, where does reverence end and worship begin?
Yeah.
It's something that I think a lot of religions grapple with.
Right. It's not just a Christian thing. It's about finding that balance, honoring key figures without going too far.
I see what you mean.
Mm.
And it's interesting because the author is coming at this from a Protestant perspective.
Which definitely influences their take on things, especially when it comes to like the Immaculate Conception.
Ah, yes, the Immaculate Conception. This is where things get really interesting. So, for listeners who might not be familiar, can you give us a quick rundown of what this doctrine is all about?
Sure. So basically, the Catholic Church teaches that Mary was conceived without original sin. The idea is that because she was sinless, she could give birth to Jesus, who was also sinless.
And that was necessary for, like, the whole salvation thing, right?
Right, exactly.
But the author, they kind of push back on this idea, don't they?
Yeah, they question how Mary could be truly human if she was incapable of sin.
Like, could she really exercise free will if she was, like, pre-programmed to be perfect?
That's kind of their point, yeah. It's this fascinating theological puzzle. Like, does being sinless mean you're not fully human?
It's deep stuff. I mean, can you really choose good if you're incapable of choosing evil? It's a head scratcher for sure.
For sure. And the author doesn't really offer any easy answers. They kind of suggest that maybe the real point is that Mary chose obedience to God.
Like, that was her big thing, choosing to say yes.
Right. And that's something that we're all called to do, right?
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's about making that choice, even when it's hard.
Exactly. And this leads us to another really interesting idea that the author brings up, Mary as the new Eve.
Ah, yes. Okay, so how does that whole thing work? Because I remember reading that part and thinking, whoa, that's pretty intense.
Well, the author draws this parallel between Eve, the one who disobeyed God in the Garden of Eden, and Mary, who submitted to God's plan.
Okay, I'm starting to see it.
Like Eve's disobedience brought sin into the world, but Mary's obedience, her yes, kind of offers this possibility of redemption.
So Mary is like the antidote to Eve.
In a way, yes. It's a powerful image, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to, this central theme of redemption that runs throughout Christianity.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about reverence versus worship, the Immaculate Conception, Mary is the new Eve. Where do we go from here?
Well, next up is a topic that always seems to spark debate. Mary's perpetual virginity.
Oh boy. Yeah, here we go. This one can get a little tricky.
It can, and the author doesn't shy away from, expressing their own views on this.
They definitely have some strong opinions. But first, maybe we should back up a bit. What's the scriptural basis for this whole debate? Because I know there's that one passage in Matthew.
Right, Matthew 1.25. It says that Joseph knew her not until she had brought forth her firstborn son. And that little phrase, until, has caused a lot of theological head scratching over the centuries.
Yeah, because some people interpret that to mean that Mary and Joseph, did know each other after Jesus was born.
Exactly. And then there are those who point to the references to Jesus's brothers in the Gospels.
So some people say that those were actually Joseph's children from a previous marriage.
Right. But the author, they're not really comfortable with that interpretation.
Yeah, they seem to think it could lead to some potentially problematic views.
Especially when you consider how other religions, sometimes justify large age gaps between spouses.
Ah, I see what you mean. It's sensitive territory for sure. So where does the author, land on this whole virginity thing? Because they do offer their own interpretation, right?
They do, and it's a pretty unique one. They propose that maybe Mary's virginity was preserved for Joseph's sake.
Oh, I never heard that one before. That's really interesting.
It is, isn't it? It's like they're shifting the focus away from the physical aspect of virginity and towards something more, I don't know, spiritual, maybe.
I like that. That's definitely thought-provoking.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if we're sometimes too caught up in the literal interpretations and miss the deeper meaning.
Right. Like, what's the real message here?
Exactly. And sometimes I think it's okay to just sit with the mystery, embrace the ambiguity.
Yeah, I can get behind that. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already. Reverence versus worship, the Immaculate Conception, the whole virginity debate. What else does the author dive into?
Well, they also talk about those moments in scripture where Mary shows, that she's not this infallible being, like at the wedding at Cana where Jesus kind of has to correct her.
Oh, yeah. That's a good example. It's like a reminder that she's human, just like us.
Exactly. She experiences the same struggles, the same doubts, but even in those moments, her faith shines through.
And that's what makes her story so relatable, I think.
Absolutely. It's not about being perfect. It's about, navigating life's challenges with faith and resilience.
And that's something we can all learn from, no matter what our beliefs are.
Couldn't agree more. And it really humanizes her, right? Like she's this revered figure, but she's still going through the same stuff we all do.
I think so, too. It's like even in her imperfections, her faith is still so strong.
Yeah, exactly. Which actually leads us to another point where the Catholic and Orthodox views kind of split off. The Assumption versus the Dormition.
Right, right. Okay, so can you remind me what the difference is again? I always get those two mixed up.
No worries. So the Assumption is the Catholic belief that Mary was physically taken up into heaven, body and soul.
Okay, and the Dormition is?
The Orthodox belief. They believe that Mary died a natural death, but then her soul was taken up to heaven.
So it's more about like when the soul ascends, not necessarily the body.
Exactly. And the author, well, they definitely lean more towards the Orthodox view on this one.
That makes sense given their Protestant background.
Yeah, they see the Dormition as more, biblically consistent. Like even Mary, as holy as she was, still experienced death like everyone else.
That's a good point. Kind of makes you think about how we view death in general, doesn't it?
It does. Is it something to be feared? Or is it just a transition to something else?
Deep stuff, man. Deep stuff. But, it's interesting because while the author critiques certain Catholic beliefs, they also seem to appreciate some of the practices, like the rosary.
Yeah, I noticed that too. It's like they're not totally against everything, just certain aspects that they see as maybe going a bit too far.
I see what you mean. So it's more about, like, finding that balance again.
Yeah.
Being respectful of tradition, but also thinking critically about what you believe.
Right, exactly. Having an informed faith, not just blindly following dogma.
Yeah, I dig that. And I think that's what makes this article so cool. It really pushes you to, like, examine your own beliefs and why you hold them.
I totally agree. It's not about telling you what to think. It's about getting you to think for yourself.
And honestly, I think we need more of that these days. Less dogma, more dialogue.
Couldn't have said it better myself. But one thing that's really stood out to me throughout this whole discussion is how the author portrays Mary's humanity.
Yeah, me too. Like, she's not this distant, untouchable figure. She struggles, she has doubts, but she still chooses faith.
And I think that makes her even more inspiring. It's like she's just like us trying to figure things out, but she never gives up on her belief.
And that's a message that I think resonates with a lot of people, regardless of their religious background.
Absolutely. It's about that universal human experience of searching for meaning, for connection.
And finding strength in something bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. And, speaking of finding meaning, the author tells this really interesting story towards the end of the article. It's about a non-Christian woman who had a picture of Mary in her home.
Oh, yeah, I remember that part.
Yeah.
What was her reasoning again?
She said something like, Mary represents all mothers. And I thought that was so powerful because it shows how Mary's story can transcend religious boundaries.
It's like there's something about her that speaks to people on a deeper level, even if they don't share the same beliefs.
Yeah, I think so too. It's about empathy, compassion, that universal understanding of what it means to be human.
That's beautiful. Okay, so as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some key things you think people should be thinking about?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that Mary's role in Christianity is complex. There's no one-size-fits-all answer, and everyone has to kind of figure out their own understanding.
Yeah, it's not about blindly accepting dogma. It's about, like, having an informed faith, doing your own research, having those tough conversations.
Right. And remember, Mary's story isn't just about her. It's about us. It's about what it means to be human, to grapple with faith, to find our own purpose.
And maybe, just maybe, in her story, we can find some answers to our own questions.
Or at least some inspiration to keep searching.
Absolutely. Okay, ready to move on to the final part of our deep dive.
Let's do it.
It's amazing how, as we've been looking at all these different interpretations of Mary, she almost always seems to end up as this kind of bridge.
A bridge.
Yeah, like between humanity and the divine.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like she represents both sides.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the author is saying that that's where her real significance lies.
Interesting. So not as a replacement for Christ, but more like a guide.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Pointing us toward a deeper understanding of his message.
Makes sense, especially when you consider how much emphasis the author puts on Mary's own humanity, you know?
Right, she wasn't perfect. She had her struggles, but her faith never wavered.
Yeah, it's like she's saying, hey, you don't have to be perfect to connect with God.
Exactly. And I think that's a really powerful message, especially for people who might be struggling with their own faith.
For sure. It's easy to get caught up in this idea that you have to be some kind of saint, but Mary's story shows us that it's really about the journey.
About trying your best, even when things are tough.
Mm-hmm. And the author even says that Mary's story has the power to unite people rather than divide them.
Which is something we could definitely use more of these days.
No kidding. The world feels so polarized right now. It's refreshing to hear a message of unity.
It really is. And, that reminds me of the story the author shared about the non-Christian woman who had a picture of Mary in her home.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. She said something about Mary representing all mothers, right?
Mm-hmm. And it just goes to show that Mary's appeal goes way beyond religion.
It's something deeper, something that speaks to the human spirit.
Exactly. We all crave that connection, that sense of belonging.
And maybe, in Mary's story, we find a little bit of that.
It's possible. Okay, so as we start to wrap up our deep dive into Mary's world, I was wondering if you had any final thoughts for our listeners, anything they should really take away from this conversation.
Well, I think the most important thing is to remember that Mary's story is complex. There's no one right way to interpret it, and that's okay.
I like that. It's about finding your own meaning.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to have those tough conversations, to challenge your own belief.
Have those hard questions.
Right, because that's how we grow, both in our faith and as human beings.
I couldn't agree more. But the author also mentions that Mary is often called the Queen of Heaven.
Oh, that's right. A queen, huh?
Yeah. And I think that image is actually really powerful.
How so?
Well, think about it. A queen rules with grace and compassion.
I see where you're going with this.
And maybe that's how we should approach our own lives. Trying to cultivate those same qualities.
Ruling our own hearts with love and forgiveness.
Exactly. Serving something greater than ourselves.
And who knows, maybe in doing that, we'll discover a whole new level of faith.
It's worth a shot, right? Well, that about wraps up our deep dive into Mary's enduring legacy.
It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has. And we hope you've enjoyed it too.
We hope it's sparked your curiosity and given you some new things to think about.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.
And remember, Mary's story isn't just a historical account, it's an invitation.
An invitation to what?
To dive deeper into your own faith, to connect with something larger than yourself.
Beautiful. And on that note, we'll say goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone. And may your own journeys be filled with meaning and purpose.